Hi, everyone, and thanks for being with us today. My name is Curtis Mitch, and I'm with the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology. And it is my task today to offer a short reflection on today's Mass reading, in particular on the Gospel reading from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 38 to 42. Today's Gospel gives us a brief excerpt from Jesus' great Sermon on the Mount, which we've been kind of reading piecemeal in ordinary time right now. And today's reading falls in the section that's called the Six Antitheses, right? This is the end of Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus uses the same formula 6 times over. He says, "You have heard that it was said by the men of old." And then he quotes something from the law of Moses. And he says, "But I say to you," and then Jesus offers a new standard. All right, he intensifies the law of Moses. He internalizes the law of Moses. And in one case, in the case of divorce, he actually repeals a concession that was made in the law of Moses. And so the whole thing is structured to show you that there was an old standard of living that God was calling his people to in the Old Testament, but now there's a new standard of living that Jesus is calling his disciples to in the New Testament. All right, in the new covenant, there's a new standard to be had. And so in all of these antitheses, and today we're reading the 5th of the 6 antitheses, in today's reading we see not only something about the morality of Jesus. All of this is about the morality of Jesus, the road that he is calling his disciples to walk. But it's also telling us about the authority of Jesus. See, you have to understand that in Jesus' day and in Jesus' world, no one would have the audacity to correct the law of Moses or to presume to raise the bar above the law of Moses. All right, so Jesus is actually doing something that is remarkable and scandalous in the eyes of many. He's claiming a Mosaic authority, but beyond that, he's even claiming a divine authority to offer God's revelation anew in a way that is intensified, in a way that raises that bar above even what God revealed to his people on Mount Sinai. So it tells us about the morality of Jesus, but it also says something indirectly about the authority of Jesus. So Jesus is setting forth these 2 standards. You have the old standard, and then you have a new standard. So what's the old standard? We begin in Matthew chapter 5, verse 38. Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth." Now, what does that mean? Well, that's a legal standard that is mentioned several times in the law of Moses. It's mentioned in Exodus 21, it's mentioned in Leviticus 24, it's mentioned in Deuteronomy 19. And what it is essentially, it's what's known as the lex talionis, or the law of retaliation. All right, although we might better describe it as the law of proportionate response. Okay, when wrongdoing is done to a person, the law of Moses calls for a strict correspondence between the crime and the punishment. Okay, the punishment has to fit the crime, but not exceed the crime. Okay, so if someone knocks over your mailbox, you can't go over and set their house on fire. That would be a disproportionate response. Okay, so the law of Moses is trying to keep tight reins on this to show that when a crime is committed, the punishment must correspond to it, must fit it in severity, must be of equal severity. All right. Now, this law sounds to us rather harsh, but in point of fact, the law of retaliation, or the law of proportionate justice that we find in the Old Testament is not an invitation for people to exact personal revenge. That's not the point of this law at all, or this particular legal standard. The point of this legal standard is to limit retribution, so that if somebody knocks out your tooth, you can only knock out one of his in response. Okay, there has to be that strict proportion. And in doing so, by limiting it, it's also showing that justice is served in this single transaction. Okay, we know how the cycle of violence works. Somebody pokes out your eye, then he pokes out that guy's eye, and then the cycle continues. Okay, the cycle of retribution continues. And so this law not only limits to make sure that justice is served in a proper and proportionate way, but it also helps to halt the whole cycle of going back and forth between someone who was wronged and someone who wrongs them, and then perpetuates and escalates the problem of violence and retribution among God's people. Okay, so this law is helping to establish justice, and by establishing justice, you establish peace. That's the old standard. Now, what's the new standard that Jesus erects? He says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I," Jesus speaking, "but I say to you, do not resist one who is evil. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your coat, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles." So what's going on here? Let's just look at these 3 scenarios. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Now, something that I think helps us to understand this is that in the cultural world of Jesus' day, in the Mediterranean world of the first century, all social interaction with other people was conducted with the right hand. So that means if you were slapped on the right cheek, it was just a backhanded slap. All right? It was more of an insult than a real injury. And Jesus is saying, well, you turn to him the other cheek, which means you're getting the full force of it the second time. It becomes more of an injury and not just an insult with the second slap. The second thing, if he sues you to take your cloak, let him have your coat as well. All right? Let the person who wants to extort you, the person whose greed is after your stuff, let him expend that greed and go ahead and give even more than is asked of you. And of course, that's the same point that is made in the third example. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. What's Jesus talking about? Well, you have to remember that in Jesus' world, the land of Israel is an occupied country. It is ruled by the Romans, and there's a strong Roman military presence throughout the land, and Roman soldiers reserve the right to compel citizens into temporary service at any given moment. All right, they had the legal right to do that. They could force you to carry their equipment, for example, 1 mile, and Jesus says, go ahead and carry it 2. As a matter of fact, we see this law in action later on in the gospel. When Simon of Cyrene is compelled to carry Jesus' cross by the Roman soldiers, that's precisely the law that is in effect here that Jesus is speaking about. All right, so what is Jesus actually getting at by asking his disciples to respond in this way to wrongs that are committed against them? Well, first, I think we might do well to clarify and say what Jesus doesn't mean. Jesus doesn't call his disciples to be, doormats for Christ. He's not calling us to allow the world to walk all over us. That's not the point of what he's getting at. Jesus is also not saying that public authorities do not have the right and the responsibility to prosecute crime, right? To put evildoers behind bars and that kind of thing. That's not what he's talking about. Jesus isn't talking about the execution or the administration of justice in the public realm. He's talking about personal life. And in personal life, he says we have 2 options, not just one option, when people have done wrong to us. What are those 2 options? Well, we can take the road that Moses himself laid out for the people of God under the Old Covenant, and that is we can demand that justice is done. We can demand our right to justice, demand our right to seek redress for whatever wrong was committed against us. But Jesus says there's also a second way, which is a different way and ultimately a better way. We don't have to demand our right to justice. We can actually waive our right to justice. We can choose not to demand our right. We can use wrongdoing that other people have done to us as an opportunity for generosity. All right? Jesus is calling us to a level of charity, a charity that is heavily padded, a charity that absorbs the wrongs of the world, a charity that bears impositions that are placed upon us patiently and lovingly. In other words, Jesus is saying, in effect, let evil expend itself in the world. In fact, we can do better than that. Let's let evil be the occasion to activate love so that evil is not the only force that's operating in the world. Christian love is an equal force. It's actually a greater force that is operating in the world and can be released and occasioned by these personal wrongs that are done to the disciples of Jesus. Now we know that Jesus practices what he preaches. He doesn't simply use his words, he actually uses his example. He lives it for us so that he can illustrate it for us. All right? And Jesus is telling us in his words, we don't have to fight injustice by making demands of strict justice. We could do that, and that wouldn't be wrong, but it's not the higher road that he's calling us to. Okay? We don't have to respond to violence with violence. We don't have to respond to greed with greed. We don't have to respond to people asserting their power over us by offering some sort of counter assertions of power over them. We don't have to do that. We can fight the wrongs and the injustices perpetrated against us with charity and generosity. And in fact, that's what you see with Jesus on the cross. He allows evil to expend itself upon him, but in doing so, he dials his love for us to the highest setting. He allows that as an occasion to love like no other person has ever loved. And therefore, Jesus shows us that evil is ultimately not just halted or limited, but is actually overcome and vanquished by the merciful love that is released when Christians generously absorb the wrongs that are done to them and use that as an occasion to be merciful peacemakers in the world. I hope this is helpful to you today. I pray that God blesses you and your family, and I look forward to seeing you here next time. Thanks.